The spring pool at the cave mouth looked like a pupil that had learned to stare. Cold air slid out across the leaf litter and touched the wrists as I assembled the kit with the habits that make a diver's hands honest. Twin tanks stood upright against a limestone lip, valves cracked just enough to tell me their breath was clean. The reel lay on the tarp, flaked in patient loops, backup lights checked and clipped inboard where the arms remember them without thought. Guideline arrows sorted along the waistband, all pointing the way no one argues about when silt climbs. Slate tucked under an elastic where it would not wander. I listened to the day once more, drew the routine over myself like a layer of neoprene, and let the mind narrow to the tunnel's ask. We had walked the approach under spruce and beech that hold their own weather. The hill carried old mining scars, small pits where someone once asked the ground for metal and got stories instead. The water here always reads as older than the air. It holds a mineral taste that sits on the tongue like a warning written by patient hands. I breathed slow at the edge and watched the surface lie to me about the darkness beneath it. There is a quiet a cave offers when you are still enough. It is not silence. It is a stacked set of small sounds, drip hidden in the entrance rift, distant trickle where flow squeezes through a restriction, faint wind moving leaf against leaf above like someone sorting paper in another room. I told myself the list again. Primary light, backups, spools, safety cutter, pressure warrants, regulators clear, long hose where it belongs, dry notes where they can be read. I put a hand to the mask and the strap answered without complaint. The first immersion is a contract. The water took temperature from the forearms in a single polite theft and then settled. Visibility presented itself as a respectable corridor or door, enough to see the scallop pattern on the left wall where older flow had carved a memory into stone. I laid the first wraps on a solid tie-off, left the real mouth side, then paid line to a secondary inside where the rock would guard it from careless current. The cave asked for horizontal body, slow fin, nothing lifted that did not deserve to move. A little farther, and the dark accepted me the way a corridor accepts someone who knows which door to ignore. The plan for this week was plain. Extend the guideline beyond the last marker placed during late winter, verify the arrows, map the bend where flow splits, and mind the gas as if it were a friend with bad knees. Surface support knew the schedule and the hand signals I would not use unless something got personal. I kept the pace small. Silt on the floor lay in fine, even dust, the kind that rises to the light beam in lazy veils if you let the fins forget their manners. The wall showed pale veins of calcite like threads caught in stone. A crayfish the color of ghosts eased backward from the light and folded under a lip, indifferent to my paperwork. Depth settled into the body, not as a number but as that comfortable pressure around the ribs that tells you the suit is doing its work and the mind is not. I ticked off the checks in the order that builds calm. Pressure stable, buoyancy steady, line free of cross, no pinch points, no hook hazards. I placed the first arrow at a junction that looked like a polite question, pointed it home. The slate took a wet pencil note about the left-hand scallops, the faint tannin stain that did not fit a hard limestone feed, and a second smell that rode the regulator air like wet leaf in old iron. Smell is strange underwater, but the mind sometimes marries taste and memory and assigns a word anyway. The passage eased down, then narrowed to a slot where shoulder and stone had to have a conversation. I stopped at the threshold and listened. That is habit, not romance. The cave tells you a lot if you let it. Flow touched the wrist hair and spoke of a steady draw toward the left fork. Drip cadence out of sight on the right counted a rhythm that did not quite land where it should. I have learned to respect small timing. I framed a low profile, laid a third tie-off on a boss that had seen other lines and did not resent one more, and slid through. Beyond the slot, the floor changed. The silt was not uniform anymore. It bore a shallow ripple that did not match the flow I felt, as if a hand had combed it against the current. I held hover and watched the surface of the dust for the minute it takes to learn someone else's habit, no movement presented. A bubble from my right shoulder paused under the roof, hung like a coin on a felt table, and refused to slide until I exhaled again, and the wake asked it to move. Something in the corner of the light chose not to be there when I turned the light there. That is a common cave trick. You do not make a note for the office about shadows, you make a note about flow and floor. I paid line into a clean arc and felt the reel's handle offer the gentle drag I set topside. A little farther, and the corridor threw a bend that carried dark confidence. The beam reached only so far before it found nothing to hold. I liked that. It meant the cave was not in a hurry to end. I dropped another arrow where a ceiling pocket might confuse a diver on the return. The plastic clicked against the line with that small domestic sound I am always grateful for. That was when the line twitched once against the glove. Gloves lie sometimes. Current can play a trick along your palm, a tiny wake that feels like a tug. I steadied the reel and waited. The line did it again, a short, neat pull that had no follow-through. I looked at the spool, at the wraps, at the tie-off behind me. Everything held the way it should. I turned the light down the line and saw nothing move but suspended dust where I had just been. The line drew tight under its own persuasion, not a lot, just the kind of tightening you do when you reach for slack with careful fingertips. I let the reel pay a breath of cord and then set the resistance a whisper firmer. The tug did not repeat. The body wanted to name that moment and pin it to something ordinary. I let it sit without a name. In tight spaces, the echo you own is the one that returns through bone and equipment. The regulator hummed its steady recipe. The long hose slipped every time I breathed like a gentle assurance. Drip cadence out there missed a beat again, then found it, then missed another in the same pattern as if a child learning to keep time had come to practice. I added that to the slate in small letters that would look less foolish later if nothing came of it. The smell leaned stronger for a few breaths and brought with it a crusted metal tang that I didn't care for. I have spent enough hours in sumps and passages to know when the air in the lungs and the water on the face are speaking two different languages. I pushed onward no faster than a snail with sense. The corridor widened to a low room where the ceiling sat just above the helmet light and the floor held a field of fragile formations that looked like tiny white candles shaved nearly flat. Every fin stroke here is a decision with consequences. I frog-kicked slow and kept the light high to avoid waking silt. At the far edge of that room, the mainline from earlier seasons appeared on the left wall, slack where someone had left it in thoughtful loops to ride out seasonal flow. The slack was gone. The line lay against the stone as if pressed there by a hand. The tie-off knot was the same family as the ones I use, nothing fancy, but the tag end showed a fresh memory of tension, the fiber set in a curve that did not read as old. Flow at my wrist said the cave was lazy, no reason for the line to hug so close. I clicked a backup light and set it wide to flood the room while the primary drilled the knot. No fray, no new abrasion, no chafe marks on the wall where pull would have polished a faint shine. I reached and the line gave nothing under the glove. It had already given what it meant to give. I wrote it down anyway. Mainline resting tighter than expected, cause not clear. I added a small arrow pointing out, because a future diver might love me for that when silt gets ambitious. I waited again. Time in caves is paid in attention rather than minutes. The drip motif struck its offbeat, matched to the earlier stutter. The smell edged back to mineral clean. My breathing found the level where thought thickens to method. The mind likes to imagine intention in materials when fear wants company. It is better to stay with adjectives that can be checked later. Tight, slack, stained, clear, moved, still. When I finally advanced the reel again, the line ran through my fingers without argument, then offered a whisper of resistance as if passing under something I could not see. I angled the beam down the corridor and marked a pale scuff on the right wall at shoulder height, not fresh enough to claim but not old enough to forget. I kept the body narrow and the light honest. The cave accepted the choice with the indifference it shows to all of us. I turned once for the ritual that protects those who live by returning. The view back held the tidy geometry of work. Arrow bright on cord, silt asleep, backup light frosting the low room, bubbles resting in pockets like punctuation marks above sentences not yet finished. For a breath, I thought the line in the mouth of the slot behind had shifted closer to the wall than when I had passed. I told the slate nothing about that. I told the mind to do the part that always matters. Keep the math simple. Keep the habits close. Let the cave speak in its own time. The last thing before I moved on was the familiar act of checking the slate's elastic, like touching a talisman that has nothing mystical about it. The band answered with clean stretch. The pencil sat where it should. I traced the letters I had written and felt them belong to the day. Then I breathed and followed the line into the next reach where the water darkened a shade and the roof dropped just enough to make even calm lungs pay attention. The next reach drew me into a throat of stone where the ceiling pressed low and the floor traded clean limestone for a fine black silt that moved if I even imagined impatience. I eased the reel forward and felt the line answer with a politeness that had weight inside it, not drag from friction, more like a partner who rests a palm on your sleeve before you speak. I paused and let the cave dictate the cadence. Breathe, check, breathe, advance. The primary beam kept to the roof so the cone washed the path without waking the floor. Backup lights sat ready at the chest, clipped where my hands had learned them long ago, steady as thoughts that survive fright. The drip motif returned from ahead and to the right, a steady count broken every so often by a miss, then a catch-up, as if the cave had borrowed the breath of a tired runner. I noted it without honoring it with a story. Timing matters, but fiction costs gas. The smell shifted again from mineral clean to a metallic sourness that rides the throat and makes the regulator taste like an old coin. That detail landed on the slate with the others, a slow row of plain words that would not blush later. I set an arrow at a sidle crack that could tempt a diver who had lost the comfort of scale. It pointed home with the usual bright certainty and for a beat looked like a small tooth in the beam. I checked the tie-off behind me, the last good hold on a limestone boss that had earned its history of scuffs and grooves. The knot sat where I had set it, but the line beyond had settled closer to the wall than felt honest. I palmed the cord, not enough to move it, just enough to feel whether anything downstream had an opinion. Nothing pulled. I let it alone and worked on, paying small loops so that any future take would have to steal in slow motion. Past the low roof, the passage widened into a gouged chamber, a place where old floods had carved shelves and thrown them back upon themselves. The floor here held silt layered in faint chevrons. They did not match the current on my wrist. They pointed a little up valley toward stone that the flow declared unimportant. I hovered and watched for the long stretch that lets a pattern admit itself. The chevrons did not tremble. My beam drifted, and that was when I saw thread-like lines in the silt. Not wormwork, not crayfish. Finer than that, parallel in pairs as if something had brushed two twigs there with a careful hand. I moved no closer. I rolled the wrist to widen the spill of light and marked the lines again. They ended beneath the mainline where it crossed the floor. I tried to make the simple explanation submit. A falling twig, a bubble train, a rodent washed in and resting, then gone. The pairs were too neat in places and then messy where they met a ripple, like someone correcting a letter in a damp notebook. Beside them, a tiny field of silt had been pinched into a ridge no longer than a finger. The ridge lay across the natural set of the chevrons at an angle that asked to be named. I didn't name it. I drew the shape on the slate with slow strokes, not for art, just for the map later when the day had become someone else's argument. The reel ticked in my glove when I moved again, a soft catch as if the line passed under something I could not see. I eased slack with respect and felt the cord come free with no chafe. The primary light put a pale coin on a ceiling bubble pocket, and for a breath the coin quivered without any motion of mine. The pocket sat where pockets sit, but the surface within it unsettled itself, then calmed, like a pond touched by a string and then forgiven. I logged that too, because I have learned to be a bookkeeper for the useless as well as the useful. Later, one of them always pays. My breathing settled into the old metronome that keeps panic honest. I stayed high and still, then offered a deliberate low frog forward. The floor barely acknowledged me. In the wider part of the chamber, the main line passed along a right-hand shelf before it dipped into a slot. The shelf carried dust so thin that the light made it into shining fabric. In that fabric ran a single clean path no wider than a pencil, following the stone edge for a stretch and then slipping down the lip toward the slot. A path like that can be gas bubble trickery or the slow drool from a ceiling pocket. It can also be where a dragged object rested while its owner breathed and thought. I wrote it in the same square hand and added nothing more. Through the slot, the world closed again. I flattened the body and let the tanks talk to the ceiling. The roof brushed the manifold with a sentence that started and stopped, and then repeated the same word as if learning it. The long hose whispered around my chest. The regulator gave its faithful hymn. In that tight, I heard the drip count shift a shade farther away, not in distance, but in direction, moving upslope against both my position and the feel of the flow. Sound does odd work in caves. The walls are poor negotiators. I fixed the memory of where the count had begun and where it had gone. Then I found a small tie-off point on a knob of limestone that the passage had rounded but not swallowed. and I took a single wrap for insurance. The next arm of the cave offered a split that looked innocent in the beam, a braid with one reach low and flat and the other higher and broken by pockets. I held still and let the silt breath of each side tell me something. The low arm gave the wrist a steady slide, the kind that means most of the water prefers that way. The high arm had almost no voice at all, but the drip count came from there, and in its stutter I felt a logic I could not yet name. I placed an arrow for the return, checked it twice because bad arrows are worse than none, and took the high arm with an unease that I kept small and inside the edges of method. The ceiling rose into a run of old phreatic tubes, those round mouths in the roof that testify to ancient water that didn't bother with gravity as much as we do. In one of those tubes sat a bubble pocket bigger than the rest. I slid under it and watched my own bubbles go up to join the others. They gathered at the pocket edge, twinned, parted, then found the main pool with a soft, repeated tick. Between ticks, my bubbles rested exactly where they should have rested. Then, on a breath where I held still and asked for nothing, they slid a fraction along the rim as if a finger had drawn a circle there. Flow at my wrist said no. I turned the beam down to check my own position. No wake, no shoulder brush, no motion to blame. In the high arm, the smell switched back to clean, and the walls lost the tannin stain. That would make sense if a dry bypass above had been venting here. It would also make sense if the low arm had carried leaf water from upstream rains that had not yet told this reach what season it was. A map is a lesson in modesty. I wrote both guesses in brief words that would not embarrass me later. I added a third note I did not like seeing, sensation of line taking a set on its own at irregular intervals, slight, no visible cause. A diver should be stingy with such sentences. I wrote it anyway. Beyond the tubes, the passage sagged into a shallow bowl where the silt lay deep and fluff-light, a place where any wrong motion writes a record. I held motion to the smallest necessary, made each kick a letter of a short word, and crossed without blurring the script beneath me. Near the far lip of the bowl, the mainline again met the wall and ran through a pair of grooves someone had carved into the limestone to keep cord honest during high flow. The grooves were polished the way a banister gets from hands. Today's flow did not deserve that polish. Still, the line hummed a touch under the glove, no more than a string on a quiet instrument when air moves by. I put the primary right against it and saw the faintest shiver climb the cord for a finger's span and stop. I considered going back to fetch the low arm now to compare routes. The gas plan would allow a measured loop with disciplined turns. The thought sat with me while the drip count found its missed beat and held it for a small sequence that I could feel inside the ribs. One beat, then another, then the skip like a blink when a light in the distance flutters and you pretend you did not see it. I let the plan bend. I took a short detour into a side pocket to set a cookie on the line as a private reminder for the return. The plastic piece clicked into place, small, trivial, the sound of drawers closing in a neat house. When I withdrew from the pocket, the groove hum had stopped. The line lay against the stone as quiet as prayer. At the edge of the bowl, a fallen flake of limestone made a small bridge. Something had brushed dust from its top in two parallel sweeps and left the dust gathered at the downstream edge as a lip. The sweeps matched the earlier marks only if I wanted them to. I told myself not to want. I set the reel on a holdfast that would forgive movement, and I took one more long look back through the path I had written with care. The pair, marks near the first chamber, the pencil-thin path along the shelf, the bubble pocket that had learned to circle, the grooved wall where a hum had climbed and then pretended it had always been still. Each could be nothing. Together they drew a word I did not pronounce. The slate lay quiet under my thumb. I added one more line and kept it plain. Return route requires fresh caution. Patterns unclear. Continue with deliberate pace. Then I took the reel again and eased into the next length where the ceiling dropped to kiss the twin tanks, and the world became a whisper between stone and patience. The drip count moved off to the left and up, and the silt at the floor breathed a fraction as if turning in a shallow sleep. I matched the cave with a smaller breath of my own and went on. The bowl pinched down to a corridor with shoulders that wanted attention. The roof came closer until my breath felt like something I owed to the stone, not the other way around. I let the tanks find their place and moved with the stubborn patience that keeps a diver out of stories told by other people. The light rode the ceiling to keep the floor calm. The reel fed the guideline with no complaint, and in return, the line whispered each small truth about where it rode. Here, a scrape along a ridge, there a glide through clear water where nothing touched it at all. The smell kept a clean mineral, with a shy hint of leaf in the regulator when my exhale drifted back along my chin. That was ordinary enough for a cave that took its season from the hills above. The drip count had moved to my left and a little ahead, but each broken beat matched the earlier sequence. It felt like a watch with a loose hand that still preferred its old rhythm. I set a tie on a pillar that had grown from floor to roof, and then pulled myself body width through a restriction that forced even the elbows to learn courtesy. On the far side, the passage stepped down and widened, and the floor wore a crust that broke under the light into chips like dried pastry. In those chips, I saw an arc where something had pressed and then lifted. It could have been my own fin from a past day when visibility had argued harder. It could have been a crayfish trying to write in a language I did not read. It also could have been the history of the cave, remembering another season. I gave it a one-line entry on the slate and left it at that. Ahead, my beam caught the pale triangle of a guideline arrow on the wall line, hung at a junction where long flow had tugged a lip in the stone. The arrow pointed deeper. I stopped and measured memory against what I saw. No one in our small circle would set an arrow there facing in. We argue about knots and where to fix a tie when a wall offers too many choices, but we do not argue about home. I let the light walk the cord to the knot and back, then worked closer on the slowest breath I can breathe and still remain inside the body. The arrow sat properly attached, not loose, not swung by a brush of water. The notch engaged the line cleanly. Its face looked like any other, scraped at the corners, a little dulled by years of gloves. I reached out and touched the cord with the back of my glove. It remained indifferent. No pull upstream, no push down. The arrow simply disagreed with our rules. It is easy to think you are the first to be wronged by a cave. More likely you are the last to learn what others knew and failed to write. I thought of old accounts where markers had been found backward by divers who later agreed their minds had been the ones reversed. I thought of prank and of panic and of simple human error. Then I remembered the clips in my waistband and the quiet agreement we share underground. I unseated the arrow with care, turned it to face the way out, and set it again. The small click it made when it found the line felt like a sentence in a language I could almost speak. I put a cookie beside it, my private promise to myself that I would revisit if doubt later grew teeth. With that settled, I laid a new section of line toward the right-hand lead where the rock promised a larger volume. The smell shifted to iron for a breath, then slipped back to clean. The drip motif fell out of step and then found itself again, now sounding farther behind than it could have moved by natural geometry. Sound in caves is a liar with reasons. I refused the invitation to turn each note into a problem and kept to brushes with truth. The line is honest, the arrow faces home, the silt sleeps, the roof is near. The world respects that kind of thinking even when it intends to test it. The corridor took a gentle bend and a rise, and a curtain of rootlets hung down from a crack like a fringe of old fabric. They swayed in a movement too small to call current, a slow dance with water that had forgotten it was moving. My beam made their shadows thin and eager on the wall. Beyond them, a ceiling pocket held a shallow bubble that caught the light like a pupil. I blew a steady stream up to it and watched the gathering shape. For a brief pulse, the rim seemed to reach, as if a lip had lifted, and then the bubble pooled into stillness as if it had never considered motion at all. I logged it without style. The reel turned a quarter in the glove and gave chord as if anticipating me before I asked. I tightened the drag to where the line would have to earn any future freedom. The high lead narrowed and passed under an arch to a shelf room where the floor dropped away with a neat, clean edge. The main line from earlier work came in from the left and followed the rim past a jumble of chert nodules embedded in pale stone. The nodules were slick with a greasy film that the light made into a soft sheen. That was out of place. Films like that usually belong to leaf seepage far above or to the leavings of small lives that choose quiet to do their business. There were no leaves this deep, and the crayfish had left other stories. I touched a gloved finger to a nodule and felt a faint drag, like oil that had been stretched thin. The glove smelled of iron when I brought it near the mask. I let the thought of old industry surface and then sink. This hill had no machines that could reach here. The slate got the plain sentence it deserved. The film trembled once without my hand near it, then calmed. At the far side of the shelf room, the line crossed a gap and laid along a wall that had been white once, and now held faint stains the color of tea. In those stains, a set of marks cut crosswise in short strokes. some paired, some single, as if a brush had been dabbed there by someone counting quietly. I matched the level of the line to those marks and found they ran under it and then continued beyond. I shifted to see whether my light had created the pattern through angle alone. The marks remained. I did not touch them. I made the best drawing I could on the slate with a pencil that had grown soft with water, then followed the guideline as it fell toward a lower passage where the roof threatened to rest on the tanks. In that press, the world shrank to the voice of the regulator and the small, muscular conversation between shoulder and stone. The long hose ticked against the chest on each flex, a familiar metronome that said nothing frightening. My primary light hesitated, then blinked in a way that spoke of an old contact in the switch. I rolled the thumb across it, and the beam steadied. I did it again, and the light held. Backup lights waited close and ready, and the calm they brought sat with me like a friend who does not talk. I offered the cave the least possible motion required to pass. Stone ticked the manifold and then forgave it. The tanks gave a letter of a word across the roof, and then silence returned. When the restriction let me stand the body up again, the line lay along the left wall and then crossed the passage at a neat right angle. I looked for the tie that would explain such a tidy geometry and found it around a rock horn that had collected a colony of tiny stalactites along its downflow side. The cord passed between the spindles without bruising them. That takes careful fingers or patient time. I had not come here since late winter and could not claim authorship. The tie looked new. It also looked like hands had wanted to show that the cave's features can be used without being harmed. I touched the horn to be sure the line could not saw if flow rose. It could not. Then another arrow appeared, and this one tightened the chest more than the squeeze had. It sat on the far side of the crossing, attached precisely, facing inward again. I hovered in the slow posture of someone looking at their own note and finding a word misspelled in a way that reveals too much. The cookie I had said earlier sat safe and unconfused far behind me. The arrow here was not mine, turned wrong by poor memory. The plastic showed a scuff on one edge that did not match the work of water. A small scrape ran along its face, as if a glove had tried to rub grime from a thing that did not want to shine. I unseated it, paused, reseated it to face the way home. The click happened as before, a domestic sound that comforted much more than it should. I added another cookie, as if two could make a promise that one could not. Then I told myself a truth I do not like to think in caves. Something here understands the grammar of our travel, even if it does not share its ethics. That thought earned no line on the slate. The slate received only the behavior. Second reversed marker corrected, unknown cause, caution escalated. I breathed through the ache that came with writing that phrase and felt calm, settle again as habit did its usual mercy. On the return glance that follows any correction, the line quivered a breath in open water with no visible hands on it. I kept still enough to make the body disappear. The quiver stopped. The drip motif offered a tidy run, with no skipped beats, sweet as a clock in a kind house. The iron tang left the regulator and the taste returned to clean stone. The surface of a bubble pocket ahead made a single slow rotation and then froze as if it had remembered manners. I advanced the reel into a pocket room where the walls leaned in until they felt like the inside of cupped palms. In that room, sound fell away to the softest registry. I could hear only my lungs and the tiny hiss where a backup light bumped a D-ring and then settled. I laid a tie off and wrote one more line on the slate in letters that felt heavier than they should. Return path now depends on my own markers more than on trust in inherited line. Proceed by method, not comfort. Then I looked back at the freshly corrected arrow and saw it exactly as I had left it, pointing home with bright certainty. Something in me took that as both kindness and dare. I let the light move forward and found the next reach waiting, low and sullen, with a floor so fine that even thinking about it would write on it. My breath slowed to match the sizes of the room. The reel sat in my hand like a tool that had learned to be patient. The cave gave the smallest nod a place can give when it agrees to keep its secrets a little longer. I followed the line into the dark shape of the corridor and promised myself that every choice from here would be paid for properly, without lies to smooth the bill. I felt the room accept me the way a tight glove accepts a hand that meets it on its own terms. The line ran ahead in a clean curve along the right wall, and the floor lay soft as breath, ready to betray me if I forgot my manners. I kept the light on the ceiling to keep the world calm, and listened for the drip count that had become a companion, whether I liked it or not. It sounded from behind and a little above, steady for a while, then shifting through its now familiar skip, as if the cave were testing whether I had been paying attention earlier. I wrote nothing of it on the slate yet, because there are moments when admitting a pattern gives it too much authority. Instead, I gave the body easy tasks. Check the tie. Check the reel. Check the long hose where it curves at the chest. Check the backup lights with a quick brush of thumb. Let the world grow small enough that each motion makes sense. The smell in the regulator stayed mineral clean, with a faint seasoning like stone rinsed by distant rain. That told me the high arm I had chosen still had some friendship with the surface, or at least remembered it. The twin tanks sat square and calm, the breathing felt honest. Even so, a diver's math has a voice that doesn't care for comfort. The plan had taught my hands when to turn, and I had crossed the place where that promise begins to get teeth. Reserves are there to keep the mind from borrowing tomorrow, but the cave was telling the story of slow compounding costs. I eased the reel to a notch stiffer and let the line ask for intention before it yielded any more. A narrow ahead made the decision for me. The roof stooped and the left shoulder threatened to speak rudely to stone if I did not flatten and give it time. I slid forward until the manifold brushed the ceiling and then stopped to listen. Flow at the wrist was faint as a sigh, moving away. The drip pattern faded and then returned at a new angle, now ahead and to the right, as if the sound had crossed inside the rock rather than in the open space. That happens where pockets and bends play games with echo. I waded through a count measured by breaths and the soft tick of a backup light tagging its clip. When I moved again, I went so slowly that the silt only lifted to the idea of motion, not to motion itself. Beyond the stoop, the floor rose and gave me a shallow terrace where I could hold hover with less work. The main line followed the rim and then dipped away into a lower bay, while a secondary lead along the terrace looked like a dry bypass that had been fed by old floods. The terrace route would keep me level and buy time. The bay would take me deeper and ask for more honest arithmetic. The smell came iron sour for a single breath, and then was gone. On the rim of the bay, the chert nodules wore that thinner film again, the one a fingertip can feel like the idea of oil. My glove remembered the drag from before. I left the bay alone and took the terrace, laying a steady ribbon of fresh line along a wall whose face bore a paler band as if waterline or memory had rested there for a long season. At a shallow re-entrant, I stopped to set a solid tie. The boss looked good, with old scuffs where other cords had kept trust in the past. The knot went down, neat and unhurried. When I tested it, the cord hummed a little, not from flow but from something in the way. Tension loaded the stone. It felt like a string tuned just shy of true. I eased the wrap and the hum ceased. The line gave a small pull back through the glove, twice, with exactly the patience of someone testing a door without wanting to be heard. I tightened the drag on the reel to match and told the mind the simple truth that the gear remains gear, even when fear tries to dress it in character. The room beyond held a ceiling pocket so low it almost kissed the mask. Old air sat there in a broad lens that made the world sparkle at its edge. I exhaled a long, steady stream and watched the lens take the bubbles in. For a few heartbeats, the rim moved as if it had been brushed, not merely fed. The surface made a traveling kink that circled once and then stopped with more precision than the weak flow could claim as its work. I hovered motionless long enough that the regulator began to feel like a clock. The lens did not stir again. I wrote the observation on the slate in tight script without accusation. A cave is a poor defendant, better to keep to facts that cannot argue back. The next split came without theater. The main line took the left shoulder of a passage that widened into shadow, while to the right a crawl under a lip offered a cleaner floor at the cost of posture. I chose the low right because it would keep silt honest, and because the left held a faded tannin stain that suggested leaf water had once owned it. Under the lip, the tanks moved with the roof in small kindnesses, and the long hose whispered over my chest where it liked to live. The primary light hesitated again, a flicker like a blink when a thought gets bright. A roll of the thumb settled it. I touched the first backup in the same motion and let its beam kiss the roof in case the need arrived without ceremony. Some distances later, the crawl widened enough that I could raise the head and see farther. On the left wall, just above where the line rode, 3 short dabs of stain made a pattern that was almost geometric but not quite. They were placed like careless punctuation, close enough that a gloved knuckle could have made them in a single sweep, yet offset in ways a half-attentive hand would not choose. The stain itself ran thinner than the tannin outside, closer to the tea tint I'd seen before. I did not touch them. I copied their spacing on the slate with a small drawing and let the line take me past their patience. It happened after that in a way so quiet that naming it risks making it louder than it was. The regulator offered a breath that tasted thin, not from impurity but from the suggestion of greater effort for less return. Twin tanks speak slowly when something begins to change. I checked the pressure information without writing it inside my head as marks and counts. I read it as a relationship with the plan and learned that the curve of comfort had begun to tilt. The return point I had promised myself lived a little behind me now, not because I had drifted, but because the sum of small delays and care had raised the price of each kick. The math settled in with the weight of a hand on the shoulder. The rule that has kept many of us alive wanted attention, and it deserved it. I set the reel against a good holdfast and lingered in hover long enough to let calm polish the edges of choice. The cave spoke in its reliable quiet, drip tick without skip, faint flow now aligned with my chosen route, bubble lens steady, silt asleep at my knees, film on nodules behind, not here, arrow corrections behind, not here. I turned my body so the return lay in the window of my light like a hallway to a known room. I wrote on the slate that the turn begins now, not in shame or in triumph, only in respect. Love for the job is a poor reason to press when the numbers, even unspoken, promise thin charity. On the way back to the last junction, the line told a new story through the glove. There was no tug this time, no neat testing pull. Instead, the cord lay with a deeper set against the wall, as if a very patient hand had asked it to hug the stone more closely while I had been looking elsewhere. I ran gloved fingers along a span and felt no chafe, no fresh polish, no grit under the strands. The cave had made room for the line, or the line had learned the wall in the time I took to think. I put a small cookie at the junction that would carry me back through the crawl and then into the room of the ceiling lens, because repetition saves lives when eyesight and we'll both get tired. When I reached the lens again, it held perfectly still, like a thought that has decided not to move. My own bubbles went to it and settled in their tidy pattern. None slid, none drew a circle. I didn't wait for a sign. I drew the light along the line and followed the cookie toward the lower lip. The drip count returned to its old trick, skipping once more on the beat that I had begun to expect, almost like a promise that could be counted on. The floor just beyond the lip bore the faintest twin track, parallel sweeps no longer than a hand laid flat, soft as breath, and vanishing before my beam could claim them for a drawing. I didn't stop to study them. The math had called the turn. Study could wait for a day that owed me nothing. At the terrace again, I paused to breathe the kind of breath you measure in calm rather than in volume. The film on the nodules trembled in sympathy as my exhale climbed the wall, then settled. The arrow I had corrected earlier faced outward still, clean and bright. I checked for the cookie that kept it company and found it where I had left it. That helped. It helped more than it should have. The mind makes bargains with small artifacts when the larger contracts are beyond negotiation. The restriction that had taught my shoulders humility accepted me with the same blunt kindness on the way back. Stone spoke once against the manifold and then forgave. Past it, the room with the shallow bay opened, and the left shoulder that would have taken me deeper now looked like an argument I had been wise to walk away from. The mainline hummed a little where it crossed the polished grooves in the wall. The hum climbed the cord a finger's span and then went still. I did not linger. The arrow I had turned earlier remained faithful and ordinary, the kind of plastic that saves lives by refusing to be interesting. The drip motif moved to my right and then overhead and then once again behind, all while I moved only a span. That is sound in caves, the old game. It felt less like a trick now and more like a clock that had learned a mood. The corridor that had first matched the ribs with pressure seemed narrower on the return, as it always does when decisions have been made and the body feels its own size. I kept my light high and let the floor sleep. The reel came in with the steady discipline of a tool earning its keep. Each tie-off got the same attention it had received when placed, no less, because fatigue is a gossip who loves to talk you into shortcuts. My breathing stayed in the zone that adds nothing to panic and removes nothing from thought. The regulator gave each breath in smooth, gentle parcels that matched the promise I had made to myself when I wrote on the slate. I reached the slot where the ceiling pocket had made its early circle, and for a heartbeat I let my bubbles rise to it again. They pooled in the same place and rested without offense. The lens gave no language, which was its own answer. The line once more lay close against the wall, with a set that seemed deeper than any flow this lazy could teach. I wrote a last note for the day because the bookkeeper in me demanded it, and then I turned my face toward the shallows. Above, day would still be day, and the trees would still arrange their shade in patterns that meant nothing and everything. Below, the cave kept its peace and its petty arguments, and I carried the cost of them in my chest as a weight I chose to pay. On the final bend before the entrance rift, the smell of leaf and cold spring rose in the regulator with a clarity that felt like stepping into a room where someone has baked bread after a season of stone. The water brightened in the light the way clean water does when it knows it will soon meet air. I placed my last arrow of the dive as a courtesy to some future tired diver, the point declaring home with no ambiguity and no plea. Then I let the line guide me through the low mouth where the world turned wider and the surface found my mask with the easy touch of a friend who refuses to be dramatic. I surfaced under the overhang and held to a lip of rock while the trees argued softly with the breeze. The tanks felt heavier in air than they ever do underwater. That has always amused me. I pushed the mask up, took a long mouthful of the day, and looked down at the line cutting into the pool with a geometry that had learned its own will in my hands, and perhaps in other hands I could not see. The reel hung from my glove with the patient weight of a tool that knows tomorrow exists. I told myself the plan for the next run would begin from caution, not from curiosity, and that the arithmetic would be carved into the slate before the water touched my wrists again. The pool settled behind me with the expressionless calm of a sealed letter, and the hill wore its green without interest as I stripped the weight of water from the harness and set the kit on the tarp with the care that belongs to ritual. I kept the mask on my head as a kind of thinking cap while I worked, letting drops tick from the strap into a small rhythm that tried to replace the cave's offbeat drip. The reel went down first, lined snug under its guide, no snarl, no hitch. Twin tanks stood against the limestone lip and dropped a whisper of cold onto my shins. Backup lights clicked alive in turn and then off again, each beam pale in sun but bright enough to make my hands remember trust. Guideline arrows rode the waistband where I had stowed them, lighter by 2, heavier by questions. The slate lay on the tarp with its clean lines that told more than they explained. Surface air had the smell of leaf and wet stone with a mild sour of spring that lives near cave mouths. That scent made the regulator taste from minutes before feel like a dream I could choose to doubt. I told myself not to. Memory is a poor witness unless you make the record with a pencil. I read the slate aloud under my breath, each note a calm sentence, each observation given the ordinary gravity of bookkeeping. Tight mainline where flow did not earn it, bubble lens that learned a slow circle and then remembered grace, pairs of fine marks in silt where nothing with legs should be writing, film on chert with an iron whisper, arrow corrections made twice at places where no prankster could have been expected and no friend would have bothered. The list looked small in daylight. It felt larger inside my chest. I took the reel in hand and tested the drag the way a musician checks a string. It responded with that quiet, polite resistance I had set under the trees earlier. No creep, no surprise. The cord near the leading rap bore a faint press as if it had lain against stone longer than the dive allowed. I knew it could have come from my own care at tie-offs, from the honest habit of hugging a wall so silt can sleep. The mind, left alone with a coil of cord, will weave intentions into fiber. I forced my thinking toward method. Rinse the lights, dry the first stage, bleed a breath from the regulators, and listen, wipe the glass, count the cookies and arrows by touch, not by eyes that can lie for comfort. The gear answered like a crew that has learned not to editorialize. I walked the edge of the pool and looked for surface traces of the questions I had brought up. The spring looked young, as they usually do, all bright eye and innocent ripple. A faint line, no wider than a bootlace, cut the algae right where the guideline entered the water. It could have been mine, made by return tension when I surfaced and settled. It could have been the simple geometry of cord and current. I touched it. Slippery film came away on the glove with a hint of iron when I brought it under the nose. The same scent had found me below on the nodules. The hill had no mines in reach of this water. I kept that thought in the holding pen where guesses live until a better reason arrives. I keyed the handset and gave a routine check to the friend who had promised to loiter at the track head with patience and a book. The reply came back a shade late, filled with leaf noise and the patience of someone who trusts that no news is the news you want. I reported the turn according to plan and the reason for it in the plainest language I own. Reserve honored. Route complexity not in map memory. Anomalies observed and recorded without conclusion. The friend asked if I wanted company at the pool. I looked at the water and the trees and the small shape of the tarp with my kit behaving, and I said no. There are parts of this work that ask for a single pair of hands on a single set of decisions. I sat on the limestone lip and let the body remember the sequence of the dive with the same slow care I use for a knot I do not wish to undo too far. Entrance, tie good. Secondary hold sound. First arrow placed where junction looked like a question. First, twitch on the line, neat and without story. Floor ripple that spoke against the current. Bubble pocket that learned to circle, then obedience. High arm chosen for cleanliness and for the taste of the air in the reg. Terrace over bay. Film at the nodules that did not belong. First reversed arrow fixed, second reversed arrow fixed. Cookies set where doubt grows like lichen. Turn called by sober math rather than fear. Return conducted with patience paid in small coins. No silt storm, no panic, only that quiet insistence the cave made on the line hugging stone beyond what lazy flow would ask. I opened the reel and paid out a hand's length. The cord lay on the tarp with the memory of wall pressed into it. Not a kink, not a bend from careless storage, but a shallow bow that understood a curve. I turned the head and held the line to the light. Fine grit clung in places along a span not long enough to account for travel across the whole dive. That might be ordinary scalp from rock where I had taken a wrap. It might also be the ghost of some new pressure applied in a room where I had been busy drawing the world into focus. I brushed the grit away, and it left no stain on glove or mind. The hill spoke in the ordinary voice of birds and day breeze. Beyond the trees, a road kept its own quiet meter that has comforted divers for as long as roads and dives have shared land. I let the calm do its work, and then stood to check the pitons at the entry lip where lines from other days still tied their remembers to rust. The old steel held. The loop where our mainline met the world felt dry and sound. I checked the knot there and found it humbled by weather and time into a shape I trust. Nothing on the surface owned malice. The mouth of the cave looked like a friend after a quarrel, ready to speak as if nothing hard had been said. I reread the slate and added a decision that tasted like metal. Next run, I would take the low bay and give the terrace a day off, because the terrace had been kind and kindness in caves can teach a false lesson. I would bring fresh arrows and a length of spare line to hang a parallel run across one of the rooms where the wall tie had sung. Not to contradict what was there, but to see whether two chords learned the same lessons when left to their own thoughts. I would choose turns that cost energy rather than buy bargains from convenience. I would watch the bubble lenses without asking them to speak. I would keep the math strict even if curiosity decided to dance. A shadow slid across the pool as a cloud learned where the sun was. Light changed the color of the entrance water in a way that made it seem deeper and older. I felt the line in my hand grow heavier, though nothing had been added to it but thinking. I set the reel back in its bag and clipped it where it lives. I checked the valve wheels by habit and left them seated against their stops so I would hear the right conversation when I opened them again. One of the backup lights had gathered a hair from a root on its clip. I removed it as if freeing a moth. I took the slate one last time and wrote a sentence with the steady hand I use when my writing is meant to cut through the version of me that will be tired later. Return remains feasible with present plan. Anomalies acknowledged but not named. Partner to be briefed without color. Next dive to begin with a test of parallel line behavior and a route across the bay. No night run, no shortcuts granted for mood. I let the pencil rest. The words sat plain. They did their work by refusing drama. They also made room for the cost that I had begun to glimpse in the cave when the arrow faced wrong and the bubble turned without permission. Costs like that ask for payment not in a rush, but in the way attention gets sliced into finer and finer threads until a diver pays with sleep, or with the comfort of believing maps are permanent, or with the generosity once given to other parts of life. Survival is not free. It collects through small debits that look like good decisions at the time. On the path out, I carried the kit in 2 trips because pride is too expensive, and a stumble at a cave mouth has ended more careers than depth ever did. The trees held their green in the honest light, and the hill did not try to be more than a hill. At the trackhead, my friend closed the book and searched my face for news that the radio could not carry. I gave the report without embroidery and without hiding the parts that unsettled me. The reply was the kind I have learned to love. A plan tightened here, a caution added there. A reminder that air writes the terms even when nerves and story want to bargain. We sat for a while with the map that pretends to be complete. I placed a fingertip on the rooms and splits I had walked with fins and patience and marked the places where the cave had chosen to revise my memory. Sound that moved without distance, line that learned the wall. Marks that did not belong to shrimp or boot or chance. None of it stood up in daylight as anything but notes. All of it arranged itself into a shape the mind could trace even if the mouth would not speak it. We agreed to give the cave one more run this week, with the daylight kept big and the arithmetic kept strict. We agreed to bring no one else and to tell no story about intention beyond the humankind. When the sun began to soften toward late, we stored the gear in the shade so seals would not learn heat they didn't need. I washed the mask and set it to dry on a clean towel with the strap arranged flat, a small care that felt like a promise to the part of me that likes to finish what it starts. The reel lay in its bag like a patient animal that pretends sleep while listening. The arrows clicked together in my hand with that tidy sound that always feels like the right end to a day. The pool below kept its private face. On the walk back down to splash a last time at the lip, I paused at the tie where the outer line met the world. The knot had not moved. The loop still sat at the same angle to the rock. The line entered the water at the same clean slant. Yet the part of me that writes the true report whispered that the geometry here had softened by a hair, as if the cord had accepted a gentler curve while no one watched. I chose not to confirm it with a measure. I let that thought live uncounted, the way a diver lets the cave keep a sentence unfinished. I tucked the slate under my arm, breathed the leaf-cool air, and let the day end with the promise that tomorrow would be earned properly. Morning kept its promise and stayed plain, which is the only weather I trust when a cave has started to edit my work. I set the tarp in the same place, clipped the reel with the care of a carpenter squaring a frame, and laid out a second spool for the parallel test I had written on the slate. Twin tanks sat straight while I cracked valves just enough to hear clean breath. Backup lights checked in the order of habit, click and hush, click and hush. Guideline arrows rode the waistband, a few more than yesterday, all tilting toward home like birds that know their route. The slate wore last night's plan in a hand that had refused drama. The friend at the trackhead read it once, then looked at me like a man agreeing to let a door close on a room he would rather not see. We left the rest unsaid. The pool met my wrists with the same honest cold, and the entrance gave me back the small sounds that had become a kind of greeting. I tied the first wraps on limestone that already knew my chord, then settled the reel into its steady give. The plan was simple, the way bridges are simple until a river rises. Lay a new line along the terrace room where the wall had sung, cross the bay with patience, compare behaviors on the way out, and keep the gas math tighter than pride would like. I told myself the list the way a diver talks to fear without letting it answer. Primary, backups, spools, arrows, cutter, slate. Method, then motion. Inside, the water wore the day like a calm coat. Silt lay down and stayed polite if I kept my fins in their schooling posture. The drip count began where it had ended, that old rhythm with a missed beat that now felt less like a flaw and more like a signature. I passed the spots that had held yesterday's questions and found them drained of theater by familiarity, which can be kindness or trap. At the room with the ceiling lens, the bubble lay quiet as glass. I let my own exhale add to it and saw no circle, no reach, only obedience. Good. That is the kind of control test a cave will grant when it is in the mood to teach without killing. At the terrace, I clipped the new spool to the mainline and paid a fresh path along the wall, keeping a respectful distance so the two cords would not court each other in a future surge. Each tie went to a boss that would not saw, each wrap seated without bite. The wall did not hum this time, or if it did, it hid the note under other talk. The bay waited to the left with its oil-thin film on the chert nodules, a sheen that pulled at the glove like a thought trying to stay. I crossed with the slow patience of someone stepping past a sleeper. At the far side, I tied the parallel line to a horn that would forgive, then set a cookie to mark the start of the experiment. The plastic clicked into place like punctuation in a clean sentence. Farther on, at the junction where the first reversed arrow had lived, the marker faced home the way I had left it. My earlier cookie still kept it company. I took the right lead again, the higher route among the roof tubes, because that was where the drip voice had learned to move without distance. The tubes held their bubbles like eyes that had fallen asleep. I checked the switch on the primary light with a roll of the thumb and felt the slight hesitation that had bothered me yesterday. The backup at my chest answered the brush of a finger with an eager glow. I let the primary stand and promised myself the usual rule. The first sign of mischief that costs time becomes the line where pride gives up the pen. Beyond the tubes, the shallow bowl lay as I had left it, script of dust unblurred, grooves on the wall polished in a way today's flow could not explain. My new line ran above the main with a modest curve, shy and tidy. I hovered and watched for a while, letting the world decide whether it would perform. Nothing moved that the body didn't cause. Then I eased along the upper cord and felt through the glove a small, repeated tremor. Not tug, not pull, a faint quickening, like a trapped insect far inside wood. I anchored my body to stillness and laid 2 fingers on the new line. The tremor went away. I lifted my hand. It returned for a handful of breaths and then kept its peace. I did not like writing that down, so I wrote it down. New chord shows faint intermittent quiver without visible cause. Stops on touch, resumes when left alone, note position relative to horn tie. Then I moved to the horn itself to check for chafe, and that was when the day changed shape. My cord lay around the horn as I had set it, neat and friction honest. Below the tie, in the shallow sag where slack rests between holds, the line had picked up a half wrap around itself, the beginnings of a hitch that no wake could claim and no careless fin could teach. It was not tight yet. It was a suggestion of a knot. Water can coil line where eddies play, but this lay more deliberate than play. I held still long enough to flavor the moment with calm rather than with the taste fear brings. Then I eased the reel and took up the hint of hitch before it grew teeth. The line surrendered without argument. I lifted it a handspan and let it settle again. It fell back into a true catenary and showed no taste for self-embrace. I searched for edges or cracks that might have guided the loop and found none. I considered the small teeth in my own gloves, the way a knuckle can twist cord when attention slips. Then I remembered the patience I had worn all morning and refused to sell myself a lie for comfort. Past the horn, the room narrowed to a gate where roof and floor agreed to keep a person honest. I flattened and slid while the tank spoke in quiet syllables against stone. On the other side, the marks on the stained wall had multiplied. What had been a few dabs yesterday had become a short tally here. Each stroke short, some paired, some single, none aligned with the easy geometry of gloved fingers. They stood just above line level, as if someone had been counting while leaning into the cord. I did not touch them. I drew them on the slate with care and kept my notes shamelessly dull. In the next reach, where the main line crosses a right angle between walls, the second reversed arrow had lived. It still faced home, and my second cookie sat faithful in its shallow shelf. Relief is cheap in caves and should be held at arm's length. I checked my gas plan and the quiet arithmetic that uses words rather than marks, and heard the schedule insist on its due. Enough to complete the test and still turn with a cushion that would not embarrass me. I set the reel for the farther tie, and that was when the primary light decided to make its case. A blink, a mutter, then a dulling that took the edges off the world. I clicked once and it steadied. I clicked again and it died, then returned on the third as if shy. I let it rest and thumbed a backup to full steadiness. The room sharpened. The mind did too. With the backup leading, the cave presented the same geometry but with a slightly different music. Shadows held closer to stone. Silt looked more awake. The line, both old and new, wore their modest glows like threads shown in raking light. The quiver in the new cord returned for the span of a breath, tugged once, small and precise, then fled. I set a tie to arrest any future mischief and felt through the glove that same polite resistance I have come to consider the cave's version of attention. I added to the slate, primary unreliable, switch likely culprit, commit to backup posture for return, no heroics. On the way back toward the terrace, the experiment paid something I had not asked for. At the first junction cookie, the new line showed a neat overhand that had not existed when I passed it to tie the horn. The knot sat newly formed in free span, not tight enough to bite, tidy enough to be unmistakable. I hung there in the water with the taste of leaf in the reg and the drip count suddenly quiet as if a listener held breath. The knot did not tighten, it did not loosen. It simply existed in a place where no edge could have helped it happen. I took it apart with the same gentle hands I used to untangle a fish from a filament, careful to memorize the lay. Then I set the span again and moved on without giving that patch of water the dignity of a stair. At the terrace wall, my parallel tie sat true. The wall did not hum. The bay lay to my side, film unapologetic on the nodules, trembling a hair when my breath touched the stone. I looked along the new cord and saw nothing else that could be mistaken for intention. I looked along the old and saw the honest slack it likes to keep when flow is lazy. Both lines held where they should. Both spoke of the same cave. Both now carried a history that cost trust a little blood. The turn came sooner than pride wanted, exactly where the slate had told it to come. I accepted it without negotiation. On the way out, the arrow I had corrected on the first day faced home with all the innocence in the world. The bubble lens in the low roof lay quiet, though my own bubbles reached for it like moths at a lamp. The drip motif returned without the skip for a stretch and then dropped a beat in a way that felt almost courteous, as if it knew I had noticed. The new line behaved as if it had never learned a knot. The glove did not feel tremor again. The ceiling brushed the manifold and forgave me as before. The world panned wider toward the entrance, and the water took on that bright clarity that promises leaf and day. Under the overhang, I paused in water to clean the slate of its worry and write in terms that would stand up to sunlight. Parallel run complete. Primary misbehavior noted. New line exhibited transient self-wrap and later a formed overhand in free span. Both removed without chafe. No visible mechanical cause. Recommend retrieval of new line for inspection. Postpone deeper push. Accept smaller circle and live to make sense later. The words carried the cost in plain letters. Fewer rooms for a while. More time on the hill turning questions into plans. Less pride to spend. Survival always invoices in these currencies, and the cave had decided I would learn the rates now, not later. I broke the surface and let the day name me back to myself. Trees argued with a kinder wind. The friend on the trackhead would hear the simple report and understand the weight under the simple. I laid a hand on the reel in the water and felt the cord slide over my glove with the friendly friction of work well done. It had no knot in it then. It had no tremor. It carried only the patience that tools learn from the hands that refuse to make stories until the evidence insists. I took a breath that tasted of leaf and stone and paid the cave the respect it was owed by promising less ambition tomorrow. I entered early enough that the trees still wore a weak gloss and the pool had the look of a mind not yet burdened by the day. The plan was narrow. Reclaim the parallel line I had set, read the room once more where the knot had appeared, and carry the cord out for inspection rather than leave the cave to practice on it. I told the list in the order that slows breath. Primary warmed, backups ready, spool clipped, cutter where the hand finds it without sight, arrows enough to make home a chorus, not a solo, slate clean except for the promise written last night that pride would not at any point take the pen. The entrance received me as if it remembered my weight. The first ties went down easy and honest. Inside, the water kept the same patient clarity that forgives careful people and punishes the hurried. Silt lay where I had left it. The drip count spoke from the reach ahead with its offbeat signature. Less a flaw now than a name passed along between friends who do not meet often. My own bubbles found the early roof lens and rested without wandering. That helped more than it should have. Control tests are small bread, but they feed the mind. At the terrace room, both chords lay like good sentences, old line at the near wall, new line shy above it. No hum, no visible sulk in the span. I eased to the horn where the self-wrap had first suggested itself and found only the neat tie I had laid. I touched it with the back of a glove to feel for heat that cannot exist and felt only stone that had learned patience over seasons longer than my work has years. I wrote that calm detail down because calm can be as important as fear in a ledger. Past the horn, the right angle crossing came, then the narrow gate, then the stained wall where the dabs had grown from a few to a tally. I stopped to look again. The marks had softened at the edges in a way that suggested water, not hands. That should have eased me. It did a little. But in the middle of the softened marks, a fresh pair sat with edges too clean for the day that had just passed. Close, slightly offset, like a thought said twice while deciding whether to keep it. I drew them in small strokes on the slate so later I would not accuse my own memory of embroidery. The bowl waited beyond, dust script intact, grooves still polished in a way today's lethargic flow could not claim. My new line ran in a gentle sweep above the main. I set my body to stillness and listened through glove and cord. For a handful of breaths, nothing told a story. Then the faint, quick tremor returned, a cricket inside wood, there and gone. I laid 2 fingers on the cord and it quieted, the way a nervous animal steadies when a palm reaches without demand. When I let go, a shorter quiver answered, like a child testing whether a rule still holds. I breathed slow and wrote the plain truth to cut the room's hunger for drama. New line shows behavior again, minimal. Pauses on touch, no mechanical cause visible. I began to gather the parallel cord, not as a retreat, but as work done. Each tie came loose under the calm the cave had granted me, each span coiled into the spool without sulk. At the horn, the line drew in, as if happy to be unburdened. That pleased me in a small, foolish way. I worked toward the terrace and told myself that the day would be spent on the hill with tools less easily misunderstood. Notebooks, maps, a pot of water, a friend's candid eyes. The knot appeared when the job was almost over. It did not bloom from chaos or leap in a showy way. One breath, the span lay clean. The next, a simple overhand sat there where no projection or edge could have instructed it. It was small, tidy, not tight yet, placed in free water between horn and cookie, like a child's idea of a knot that wants to be praised for neatness. I held perfectly still in a posture I have learned from hours spent making fear earn every inch. The knot did not tighten. It did not relax. It simply existed as if it had always been meant to live in that span. There are explanations that do not humiliate physics. A curl from storage springing back to life. A twist from a careless wrist returning like a habit. A lazy eddy building a loop, then asking weight to ratify it. I also own the memory of minutes spent with that span in clean water, my hands careful, my eyes doing the work they were given. I watched for a long time and gave nothing for the room to steal. Not an extra breath, not a flick of fin, not a thought said with my hands. Then I reached to take it apart with the kindness reserved for removing a hook from a fish that you intend to release unhurt. The line tightened under the glove. Not a yank, not a mean tug. A thoughtful, precise draw that took slack from the span until the knot fattened with confidence. I steadied, widened the beam to see whether flow had changed, whether my own shoulder had offered a wake to the cord. The water around me lay as idle as Sunday. Dust at the floor did not lift, bubble at the ceiling did not slide. The knot settled into a clean shape and stopped as if pleased with itself. The drip count went mute in a way that felt like the cave refusing to cough in a quiet room. This was the first moment in the run when fear tried to stand at the front of the class. I let it wait in the hall. I rolled my wrist and set the line across the back of my glove where glove cannot grip. The knot did not tighten further. I reached the cutter with a calm I did not have to borrow, placed its edge against the free tail where a slip would hurt least, and spoke to the part of me that hoards gear as if tools have blood. The sentence was simple: survival first, then pride, then cordage. I eased the knot until its appetite showed, then cut the tail short enough that it lost leverage. The knot softened like a mouth that has decided not to speak. The line relaxed to a true curve. The room did not reward me, and I did not ask it to. I left a cookie and a bright arrow for the next me who would pass here, whether that person was tomorrow me or a stranger with better stories. The marker pointed home with a clarity I was suddenly greedy for. I took up the last of the parallel line until only a modest span remained for later retrieval at the terrace. Then I turned the day toward the entrance with a decision that tasted like metal but also like clean air. The deeper push goes back into the drawer for a season. This cave has told me its price for curiosity, and I have learned to count. On the return, the drip motif resumed its offbeat with a calm that felt almost friendly. The stained wall held its softened marks, and the new pair kept their edges as if they wanted to be remembered. The roof tubes carried their bubble eyes, unblinking. I traced the path past ties that had been kind, through squeezes that had learned my shoulders, along grooves polished by older seasons. My primary stayed holstered, the backup led with the steady light of a tool that does not gossip. At the terrace, the last span of my new line drifted like a ribbon, shy and tame. I picked it up without ceremony and wound it until the spool held a story I would not let the cave edit any further today. Near the entrance, where the world begins to widen and light learns to reach into rock, the main line lay close to the wall with that deeper set I had come to know. I touched it with the back of a glove and felt no pull. Perhaps it had simply learned to rest. Perhaps it had been moved and was now finished with its opinion. I left it the way I had found it and let the arrow at the lip declare home in a voice even a tired diver can trust. The surface met the mask with the uncomplicated kindness that makes a person believe in daylight. I moved under the overhang and held the rock the way a bookkeeper holds a ledger when the sums have been checked twice. On the tarp, the friend's shadow waited in the posture that says, "Questions can be asked without needing to be answered right away." I put the spool down, heavier now with wet cord, and with the weight of a choice paid for in modest gear rather than in luck. We read the slate together. I spoke with the same dull precision I use when logging samples. Parallel recovered. Free span not formed under observation. Cut tail to null leverage, not lost appetite. No silt disturbed, no flow change noted. Drip voice paused, then resumed. Marks on wall softened. Fresh pair added. Primary light still unreliable. Backup carried the day. Decision recorded. No deeper push until parallel chord behavior and mainline set can be understood topside. Retire this cave for a spell unless necessity writes otherwise. The cost took a shape while I spoke. It was not the price of a broken thing or a bruise hidden under a sleeve. It was the quiet subtraction that happens when faith in maps gives up a small room in the chest and does not move back in. It was a new caution that would follow me into other water, other hills, and ask for its tithe each time I laid a line and pretended that chord is only chord. I would pay with early turns, with days spent on banks instead of in tunnels, with the patience to leave questions unanswered when arrogance wants to spend answers like coins. I rinsed the reel, pulled the cord through a towel until it lay clean, and found along one span a faint kink that spoke of a knot remembered and then forgotten. I kept it as it was, a small wrinkle that would teach the hands a different touch next time. The arrows clicked together with their bland cheer. The backup lights dried with their lenses pointed away from sun. We carried the kit in 2 trips to the track, and each time the woods looked exactly like woods, which is the kindest disguise a place can wear. Before we left, I walked back alone to the lip and looked at the line where it entered the pool. I considered the kindness of cutting it and bringing it up, leaving the cave without a leash, without a way to correspond. I left it in place. Some conversations you end by listening. I set one more arrow at the outer tie, a bright triangle pointing to daylight in a way even a panicked stranger could not mistake. Then I wrote one last sentence on the slate and spoke it aloud so the part of me that believes only air would hear it properly. I will live with less map and more patience. The cave can keep its grammar a while. The pool did not answer. The drip below settled into the beat it prefers. A leaf touched down on the surface and chose a direction without asking anyone. I shouldered the pack and stepped onto the path with the sensation of stepping off a line I had not noticed underfoot until that moment. The hill kept its green. The road kept its meter. I kept the cost where it belonged, paid and a little tender, a reminder not to spend what I cannot earn back.